Reading The Unknown Reality by Jane Roberts, a Seth book, Volume 2. Session 722. Seth states, he says, I told you to take a moment while you were within a particular dream and to use it to try to discover what had been happening within the dream before you experienced it. It is true that you create your own dreams, but it is also true that you only focus upon certain portions of your dream creations. Even in the dream state, any present expands into its own version of past and future. So, in those terms, the dream possesses its own background, its own kind of historic past, the moment you construct it. You need not experience those past dream events, although if you just turn your attention in that direction, then the dream's past will become apparent. Mental impressions of any kind, therefore, are not simply imprinted or written, as it were, in a medium of space and time. They have a greater dimensionality. The past and future ripple outward from any event, making it quote-unquote thicker than it appears to be. In greater terms, the past is definitely created from the present. In your system of reality, this does not seem to be the case at all, since your senses project a forward kind of motion outward upon events. Quote, subatomic particles, end quote, however, appear in your present, rippling into your system's dimensions, creating their own quote-unquote tracks, which scientists then try to observe. In some cases, unknowingly, your scientists are close to observing the birth of time effects within your system. Since your brains are composed of cells with their atoms and molecules, and since these are themselves made of certain invisible particles, then your memories are already structured by the biological mechanisms that make them possible in your terms. Okay, pausing real quick. The next page is going to explain this, but I want you guys to know the invisible particles that Seth is talking about here is the CUs, or units of consciousness. So keep that in mind until he actually explains that. So Seth goes on, he says, after death, for example, you still possess a memory, though it does not operate through the physical organism as you understand it. Psychologically, then, while you are living, your memories follow a pattern of past into present. It seems, therefore, quite inconceivable that, in certain terms, any present event can bring about a memory of a similar event that occurred before, while instead, each actually occurs at once. In the dream state, the freedom of events from time as you understand it can be more apparent. If you are alert and conscious while dreaming, and you can learn to be, then you can catch yourself in the act of creating a dream's past and future at once. Physicists know that waves can appear as particles upon certain conditions, and that particles can behave like waves. So moments as you understand them are like waves experienced as quote-unquote particles, as small bubbles, for example, each one breaking and another forming. Subatomic particles also behave like waves sometimes. In fact, it is usually only when they act like particles that they are perceived at all. Physicists think of atoms as particles. Their wave-like characteristics are not observed. At other levels of reality, atoms behave in a wave-like manner. Subjectively, you will think of your own thoughts as waves rather than as particles. Yet, in the dream level of reality, those waves, quote-unquote, break into particles, so to speak. They form pseudo-objects from your viewpoint. While dreaming, you accept that reality as real. Only upon awakening do the dream objects seem not real or imaginary. The nervous system itself is biologically equipped to perceive various gradations of physical matter, and there are quote-unquote in-between impulse passageways that are utilized while dreaming. From your point of view, these are alternate passageways, but in the dream state, they allow you to perceive as physical matter objects that in the waking state would not be observable. Again, from the waking standpoint, these other neurological recognitions could be thought of as ghost or trace methods of perception. Waking, you do not usually use them. They are utilized to some extent in daydreaming, however, and in certain alterations of consciousness, while you perceive as real or nearly real events that are not immediately happening within your space-time structure. The dream world is as organized as your own, but from the waking state, you do not focus upon that inner organization. Your dream images exist. They are quite as real as a table or a chair. They are built up from particles, invisible only from the waking situation. Physicists are beginning to study the characteristics of quote-unquote invisible particles. They seem to defy space and time principles. This is precisely why they form the basis for dream reality, why objects in a dream can appear and disappear. In your physical universe, such particles are invisible components, deduced but never directly encountered. To a certain extent, they are latent. In some other realities, however, their characteristics rule rather than the attributes of the visible particles that you see. Dream images, therefore, exist at a different range of matter. Okay, so anyone who wants to read this little side note right here during their break, go ahead and read that, but I'm not going to. Seth goes on and he states, now, many of these invisible particles, or CUs, can be in more than one place at a time, a fact that quite confounds the physically tuned brain, perceiving a world in which objects stay where they are supposed to be. Basically, however, each quote-unquote appearance of such a particle is a self-version, for it is altered to some extent by its quote-unquote location. So can the human self appear in several places at once, each such appearance subtly altering the quote-unquote human particle, so that each appearance is a version of an quote-unquote original self that as itself never appears in those terms. When you look at an electron, figuratively speaking, you are observing a trace or a track of something else entirely, and that appearance is termed an electron. So the self that you know is a physical trace or intrusion into space and time of an quote-unquote original self that never appears. In a way, then, you are as ghostly as an electron. The unknown self, the quote original self, end quote, straddles realities, dipping in and out of them in creative versions of itself, taking on the properties of the system in which it appears and the characteristics native to that environment. Waves and particles are versions of other kinds of behavior taken by energy. Using that analogy, you flow in wave-like fashion into the physical, particleized version that you call corporal existences. I am putting this as simply as possible, but when your, quote, original self, end quote, when your original self enters part of itself into three-dimensional life from an inner reality, the energy waves carrying it break, not simply into one particle following our analogy, but into a number of conscious particles. In certain terms, these are built up using the medium at hand, the biological properties of the earth. They spread out from the, quote, point of contact, end quote, forming individual lives. In your conception of the centuries, then, there are other counterparts of yourself living at the same time and in different places, all creative versions of the original self. There is a great intimate cooperation that exists biologically and spiritually between all of the beings on your planet, quote, at any given time, end quote. You are all connected psychically in terms of inner and outer structures. A certain identity and cohesiveness is also maintained because of these inner connections. There are psychic structures quite as effective as physical ones, and these underlie the reality of your objective world. They merge together beautifully to form an inner picture of the world at any given quote-unquote time, even while that picture is ever-changing. In greater terms, the picture of your world at any given time can be compared to the position, behavior, and characteristics of an invisible particle as it is quote-unquote caught intruding into your reality. Your dream adventures, however exciting, remain quote-unquote invisible from your waking standpoint. Within dreams, space and time expand, again, as I have mentioned, but in a way that you cannot physically pinpoint. Your own exterior space exists in precisely the same manner from the standpoint of any other reality. For that matter, you yourself are so richly creative that your own thoughts give birth to other quite legitimate systems of which you have no knowledge. This giving birth that Seth mentions, Rob inserts a quote from chapter 16 of Seth Speaks, where Seth first stated, quote, each mental act opens up a new dimension of actuality. In a manner of speaking, your slightest thought gives birth to worlds, end quote by Seth, from the 565th session. And Seth goes on. Now, you are each members of a particular race, and you do not feel any less individualistic because of that affiliation. You consider yourselves further members of a species. The races are alive together at any given time on your earth in varying proportions. So there are physical organizations, biologically speaking, that you recognize. You do not feel threatened because you do not have your particular race to yourself. So there are inner psychic quote-unquote races to which you belong, or psychic stocks, so to speak, each providing physical variations. In those terms, each living person has other counterparts of himself or herself alive, generally speaking, at the same time, sharing the physical face of the earth. There are psychic pools of identity, therefore, and generally speaking, those alive in any given century are as much a part of that inner pool as they are a part of the particular race to which they may belong. Each member of the species is an individual, and each member of a psychic pool of identity is an individual. Again, your idea of personhood limits you when you think of these concepts. You imagine personhood to be a kind of mental particle that must have definite boundaries or it will lose its identity. The identity of even the smallest consciousness is always maintained, but not limited. If you can think of your present idea of identity as if it were but one shape or one motion of a moving particle, a shape or a motion that never loses its imprint or meaning, then you could also see how you could follow it forward or backward to the shape or motion taken, quote, before or afterward, end quote. You could retain the identity of yourself as you know yourself, and yet flow into a greater field or wave of reality that allowed you to perceive your own other motions or shapes or versions. You could become aware of a larger structure in which you also have your own validity, and therefore add to your own knowledge and to the dimensions of your experience. You can do this the easiest way, perhaps, by observing yourself in the dream state. For there, you create versions of yourself constantly. In the morning, you are enriched, not diminished. You are the living version of yourself in space and time, around which your world revolves. The great potentiality that exists in the unknown self, however, also actualizes other such focuses, and in the same space-time framework. They are not you any more than you are the black man, or the white woman, or the Indian woman, or the Chinese man. As certain races possess their own characteristics and shared biological background and come from the same biological pool, however, so these counterparts come from the same psychic pool and physically seed the members of the races at any given quote-unquote time. In such a way, mental abilities and propensities are given a greater range and distributed about the earth. The session is over, but I'm going to do session notes. And if you want to pause and read this is basically talking about how Jane hasn't been reading the sessions after because Rob hasn't caught up with his typing of his shorthand. Going to session note number 2, it states, Rob states, for some background information on Seth's basic unit of consciousness, or CUs, cells, probabilities, time structures, and other material in connection with his delivery here, he suggests reviewing these sessions in Volume 1 of Unknown Reality, Sessions 682 to 84, Session 688, and Session 694. And I'll find those links. And then number 3, Rob states, a number of subjects related to Seth's discussion of waves and particles can be found in the following sources, some of which contain their own references in Appendix 18. The quotations from the 755th session, which we haven't read yet, Seth stated, quote, my own psychological reality is not particleized, end quote, by Seth. So very interesting. And He's saying go to note 24 and 35 in Appendix 18, and then to also see note 9 in Appendix 19. So again, when those are ready, you'd go to those. And note number 4, Rob states, I doubt if by his statement Seth means that physicists are attempting to study his CUs. Certainly not yet, although a few scientists who have written us thereby show that they're familiar with Seth's thinking here. Rather, some quote-unquote modern physicists are searching for non-material quote-unquote particles that certain theories, one of them having to do with quote-unquote quarks, for example, should exist if the theories are valid. Such pseudo-particles then are mathematical entities that can affect the actions of physical objects. Okay, note number 5. Rob states in Volume 1, see Seth's first delivery for the 681st session, where he states, quote, I told you once that there were pulses of activity in which you blinked off and on. This applying even to atomic and subatomic particles, end quote by Seth. And then Rob goes on, he says the full session should be reviewed, especially those parts dealing with the, quote, greater inner unpredictability of any molecule, atom, or wave, end quote by Seth. Note 8 is actually really good little note, so I'm going to go back to that and read it to you guys from session 713. It's very short. So going back to that, note session 713, note 3, from the 453rd session from the Seth material, he states, you do not understand the dimensions into which your own thoughts drop, for they continue their own existences, and others look up to them and view them like stars. I am telling you that your own dreams and thoughts and mental actions appear to the inhabitants of other systems like the stars and planets within your own, and those inhabitants do not perceive what lies within and behind the stars in their own heavens, end quote. So, that was definitely worth rereading, right? Okay, back to where we were. Going to note 9, Rob notes, a note added 2 months later. In retrospect, it's easy to see that while discussing his ideas of counterparts here, Seth was also preparing us for the families of consciousness material he was to start giving in January 1975. See the 732nd session in section 6. That's where it really starts to pick up, and that is actually the main reason why I wanted to read this book versus volume 1 first, because of these families of consciousness or species of consciousness. It is so interesting, so thought-provoking. He goes on, he says, in that session, Seth was quickly at pains to say that belonging to a certain family of consciousness did not come first in our reality. He states, quote, your individuality comes first, end quote, by Seth. And number 10, Rob states, material in many of the sessions in the first section of Volume 1 touches upon the contents of this paragraph. In the 687th session, Seth stated, quote, I am saying that the individual self must become consciously aware of far more reality, that it must allow its recognition of identity to expand, move beyond the concepts of one God, one self, one body, one world, as those ideas are currently understood, end quote. So I will definitely put that link for you guys. That's really important. And Rob adds that Seth, in his preface for Volume 1, states, quote, Here, I wish to make it clear that this book will initiate a journey into which it may seem that the familiar is left far behind. Yet when I am finished, I hope you will discover that the known reality is even more precious, more real. End quote by Seth. And the next session, if you guys want to read my little notes up here, you can pause and do that real quick. But Rob states that it's about your worldview and the worldviews of others, language, inner sound, and dreams. And it will have practice element 17. So definitely look for the next video. If you are subscribed, get the alert.